So it's an honor to be here representing the EDM Council. If we could hold questions to the end, that'd be great. And just try to make them as direct as possible in the interest of time. So I'm Matthew Ayearst. I'm the ex-head of Sustainability Management Consulting at CGI. Prior to that, I led large regulatory programs at BMO Capital Markets. I've got 20 plus years in capital markets experience doing risk regulatory, structured trading, debt origination, syndication, and I'm currently working with a few startups in Europe on climate data and ESG data. So on the panel with me, I've got Alka Bhide, who is the regulatory programs manager at ADEC Innovation. She's focused on North America, UK, Australia, and Europe. And she advises clients on major ESG reporting frameworks, so like TCFD, IFRS. I think you've heard those acronyms before. In her previous role at BMO, she integrated the climate risk as a transverse risk across all lines of business and represented BMO in government consultations. She also currently teaches environmental management at Seneca College. Further to my right is Sean Delsnider, and he's the Director of Sustainability and Climate and Technology Solutions at Deloitte. Sean has worked for clients in energy, industrials, consumer goods, life sciences, and government. He has deep integrative and transformative experience, and having led large, sizable, complex projects across strategy, planning, and execution. And prior to Deloitte, Sean spent over a decade in the energy industry, including 2 years in an executive capacity as a member of a Canadian leadership team of a multinational organization. And then finally, we have Lindsey Walton, who's a Director of Americas for the UNPRI, so that's the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. Lindsey was a founding member of Climate Engagement Canada. She won Canada's Clean 50 Award, for her leadership in collaborative work, and was the architect of the PRI's global community of practice model, which brings investors together to build responsible investment ecosystems. She's been a director at the Women for Capital Markets and has about more than 10 year, a very long career in capital market risk. Yeah, venture capital. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention you're on the board of Nellie's Shelter.
Oh, thanks.
So yeah. So as an introduction to this panel, thematically, I wanted to lift something from the EDM Council's own playbook on ESG that was published in April 2024. So there's a global shift in the way that ESG and sustainability data is used. The velocity of change in data requirements and regulatory expectations is very rapid. However, many companies currently lack a coherent approach for ESG and sustainability data management. 2, an embedded data culture and appreciation for the value of data as a means to meet disclosure requirements and manage sustainability-related issues. 3, clarity on the standards required to meet regulatory and assurance requirements for ESG and sustainability data. And 4, technology strategies to address ESG and data-related challenges. So by understanding the above, sustainability managers can effectively engage their counterparts in finance, data management, internal controls, and technology to achieve appropriately governed and managed ESG and sustainability data and disclosures. So I want to start by asking Lindsey. So the UNPRI has its own resources on data called Driving Meaningful Data. And you've written on understanding the data needs of responsible investment, and also on climate data, net zero, and closing the gaps that investors need. What are investors seeing from a data perspective, and where are their expectations at this stage?
Sure, thanks, Matthew. First of all, I just had to say I am not an AI expert, so I was watching the presentation previously, and I have never heard of these examples. So I'm sufficiently terrified, but I appreciate being invited to the conference. Just to give you some highlights around the PRI as well. So we're the largest responsible investment organization in the world. So we have 120 trillion assets under management. If you consider all of our investor signatories, we have 5,600 investor signatories globally. So I'm not speaking on behalf of them, but speaking through having conversations with them. So what we're hearing from investors is that they need the data. They don't have the quality data. They don't have the comparable data. And you all are experts at issues with, data quality. So I'll go more into why this matters. So what we're hearing from large investors is that they have a lot of regulatory requirements and expectations from their own stakeholders. So in order to fulfill these, they need data from their underlying investments. And where they can't get that data, it's starting to really impact their decision-making on whether to invest in these areas. And then there's stewardship conversations as well with investee companies. So to go a little further up the investment chain as well, this will put pressure and is putting pressure on corporates from investors like investment managers. But one step even further, if we look at asset owners like big pension plans, foundations, endowments, that sort of thing, they're also putting in big, lofty goals around climate change and other sustainability factors. So they're pushing those goals down on investment managers, who are in turn pushing them down onto corporates. So we're seeing this, it's not just we're looking for green bonds and we want to know what your thematic fund is doing anymore. It's we want to know how you're incorporating sustainability broadly in your risk return models in our value, so that they can incorporate it in their valuations. So it's becoming and has become quite mainstream. So that's what we're seeing. That's what investors expect. The problem with that we're seeing where it's not standardized is where there's not enough regulation and policy to ensure that everyone's reporting the same way and that the information is comparable and verifiable. So Canada is one of the more low ESG regulation jurisdictions in the world. So some of the worry there is that Canada might be left behind, might be less capital worthy globally, because we don't have the same level of disclosure as somewhere like the EU, somewhere like the UK, and increasingly other jurisdictions around the world.
So next question is to Alka. Thanks, Lindsey, and Sean. So given the fact that the CSSB, which is the Canadian consultation on the IFRS regulation, was out for public consultation and just closed this week. Companies globally are now sort of working on the CSRD as well, and requirements for that are in 2025 and 2026. So what are you seeing as the challenges for clients with data?
I would say that hopefully this is on. I would say that there's three main challenges that clients are typically seeing. There's a variety of frameworks, as Matthew mentioned, a lot of different acronyms are out there between IFRS, which stands for the International Finance. Yeah, it's the ISSB is the International Standards for Sustainability Board, and they've created these documents that ask different companies to report on their sustainability data from a variety of different functions, whether it can be for governance, it could be strategy, risk management, metrics. And what companies are seeing is that the requirements per jurisdiction can be very different. So when Matthew mentioned CSRD, Europe is using a different set of requirements than the IFRS is using. There are a lot of overlaps, but that doesn't mean that they're exactly the same. So even if you'll see big sub-items or you might see overall topics that are duplicated, the type of data you might need to pull to answer these different requirements are different for different jurisdictions and even for different types of organizations, from an asset manager to perhaps a large consumer goods company. So that's one of the big challenges. Another challenge is how data at different organizations is extremely fragmented. And I know that's a general problem with data management on an organizational level.
It's like the unstructured data problem.
Yes, exactly. So the ESG data, these reporting standards are asking companies to collect data from all of these different lens of the organization, from their real estate division, capital markets, all sorts of different ones. So getting the same data from different types of data streams, different types of lines of business, this is very difficult for organizations who might not have a centralized place where this data is collected. And finally, most large companies work with third-party suppliers. They have a very diverse supply chain, and they don't always have the best visibility into their supply chain. So when these standards are asking for additional data, from these third-party suppliers, from these contractors, they may not be able to provide it. And these are all requirements that are common amongst CSRD, amongst the CSSB, the Canadian Sustainability Standards, things that have been collected, and in what the IFRS is requesting as well.
Thanks, Alka. Sean?
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Maybe more from a technology perspective, with these evolving regulatory requirements. Obviously, the economy is a bit challenging right now. There's constraints on capital. Sustainability leaders are finding it very difficult to actually spend their time looking forward, strategically planning on how they can optimize ESG performance, because they're so bogged down with just getting the reporting out the door, because it's a monumental task. And so really what this is creating is two major challenges. So first off, timeliness. So in the past, the sustainability leader would get a sustainability report out the door the next year sometime. Sometimes it takes 7, 8, 9 months by the time they gather all the data and put it together. Now with these reporting requirements as we move forward, most likely becoming mandatory, there's going to be more of a similar cadence to what you'd see on financial reporting. So you've seen how big financial reporting organizations are within companies to get those figures out the door. Imagine that now for sustainability. So there's going to have to be something there to help them get those numbers in a more efficient way. The second thing is complexity. So the type of data that you typically would report out for sustainability is not sitting nicely in an ERP and perfectly in good form. It's scattered throughout spreadsheets across multiple stakeholder groups in the organization, and so it's quite a feat to get that all together and making sure that's auditable, it's consistent, etc. So we see technology playing a really, really important role in bringing that all together and allowing companies to be very confident in the data they're putting out into the market. One, but two, and I think arguably more importantly, is the value add perspective. So how are they taking that data and then understanding how are my ESG programs performing throughout the year? How do I allocate capital and resource to the place that we need it? And then at the end of the year, it's not a once look back saying, hey, we didn't meet our targets. It's like, oh, well, you know what? We actually can pivot a couple times throughout the year and actually optimize our performance. So we're seeing technology and data being really, really key in helping organizations not only meet compliance requirements, but doing it more efficiently and providing greater insight.
And some of the data is very, very new data to corporations that never handled it before. And then just the fact that there's the enormity of the data itself, huge data sets, right?
Totally. And like the CSRD alone has over, I think, 1,100 different data points. So just to put that in perspective, and this is spanning across the organization. And it's funny because Alka was talking about the different regulatory regimes, and you would think that we'd be scrambling here in Canada to go to the Canadian standard, but really what we're working mostly with our clients on right now is the CSRD, which is the European regulations, just because they are going to be mandatory before many others, and we're anticipating upwards of 1,300 Canadian companies will actually be subject to this. So it's a moving landscape and a lot of moving pieces. So it's complex, but we're helping our clients really get through it.
It's a really good point, and sort of good segue into, can we talk about best practices, right? Like, can you tell me some success stories that you've had with clients in their data management, and what were the sort of the keys or the success factors that contributed to this success story? I guess, Sean, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So if I were to think about general themes, I think collaboration would be one, and then the other would be, I think, standardization and consolidation. So we'll start with collaboration. Alka mentioned as well, it is so critical that the entire organization works together because there's so many different facets that come together for these reports. So I'll give you an example. If you were to take a bank, for example, so you've got sustainability is overall responsible for the program, but then you've got corporate real estate who's providing the scope 1 and 2 emissions inventory because they're responsible for the buildings and the built environment. You've got enterprise finance responsible for the reporting. You've got capital markets providing information for your scope 3 or value chain. You're speaking with procurement on some of your purchase goods and services. So many different stakeholders need to come together. And so getting the collaboration and the buy-in from day one is going to be critical, in addition to all of your data professionals and your technology professionals as well, so that you can actually get a system in there to actually help you manage this entire thing. So that's on collaboration. On consolidation and standardization, I think there's this new concept of interoperability, which is what the different regulators are starting to talk about. Much of the data is the same across the different frameworks. And so to the extent that you can understand both your current and prospective data required to satisfy the metrics, think about it in a way of if you're going to be across multiple jurisdictions with multiple frameworks, how do you do that in the most efficient way possible? And so we'll oftentimes help our clients do the gap assessment and line it all up so we can figure out what data we don't need and how we can not duplicate efforts. And then taking that one step further from a technology perspective is building out that foundational data layer. So how do you have the single pane of glass, the one-stop shop with all of your ESG data in it, so you know who's touching it, when they touched it, is it of good quality, where is it going, et cetera. And if you look at from a technology perspective, there's really a couple different ways to do this. And I wouldn't say it's a silver bullet in any way. So there's a couple different solutions out there. So first off, there's what's called a carbon management solution, which builds out your scope 1, 2, and 3 inventory. There's an ESG data management platform, which would take that information and start to bring in your social and governance information as well. So you've got a repository of data that you can start to work on, understand performance, et cetera. And then there's what's called a last mile reporting solution. So that's taking all that information, looking at what frameworks you subscribe to, and then lining everything up so you can actually get your reports out the door and report out properly. So if there was one thing that I'd say we work with our clients on to start this out, it's getting that foundational data layer in place, because once that's started, then you can grab all the information from supply chain systems, HR systems for the social categories into one spot, and then you have control over the data that you're reporting out to the market and your various stakeholders.
Right. Alka?
One of the big things that I would say in terms of a success story is really focusing on that supply chain and understanding where all of your data is coming from. Because you're looking at reporting on such a large frame of data, you need to make sure you have easy lines of access to all of the different groups you're working with within the organization and external to the organization. And this is something that we're already seeing from a regulatory context in Canada when you're looking at the Canada Forced Labor and Slavery Act, which is asking you to look at your own supply chain and do human due diligence. I think one other big issue that you want to look in terms of a success story is a company like Microsoft. So Microsoft is a service, and you think, oh, they don't have so many facilities, they don't have so many products, so they couldn't possibly be emitting that much. But their data centers use up a lot of energy. All of their people who use Microsoft Teams and Outlook and all of these programs we use every day, they're using emissions by using the energy to run these programs. So what they do is they have a great supplier program where they will engage with a lot of their big vendors and ask them to report on the emissions that they have produced for their specific service. And then this can all be aggregated up to the Microsoft level, and then they produce it in their overall sustainability report. And I think the other biggest thing that companies need to do moving forward to be a success story is that even though this regulation, even for CSRD, is not coming till 2025, 2026, is you need to look ahead. It's so easy in a lot of industries to just see what's needed for the next quarter, what's needed in the next 2 quarters. But with sustainability data, you need to be thinking a couple quarters ahead. You need to be thinking when you're ready to report on this legislation, processes need to be in place already to collect the data so it's all ready to report by 2025 or 2026. And things like CSRD are coming out on graduated timelines. So more and more companies will be in scope for different pieces of legislation the more time passes. SEC in the US, even though it's temporarily paused, more companies will fall in scope or have more reporting requirements as the years go on to give companies this time to adapt, to give them time to create these data management processes. So it's important to use this time that the regulators have given to collect data and have it ready to go so that it's not scrambling at the last minute and you have clean, coherent, and easy to understand, transparent data.
Are spreadsheets okay at this point?
At this point, yeah, it's a great place to start.
Okay.
You would be shocked at the size of organizations that are using purely spreadsheets right now. Maybe not.
Yeah, Excel. So I guess how will better data be beneficial to the marketplace and to companies and to sustainable goals? And I kind of want to make the argument here that, better data is actually better for business, and it's not just about checking a box. So Lindsey, you want to opine on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. So better data obviously leads to a number of value add pieces, but why it's really important right now, and maybe just to give you some anecdotes, is so that it makes everything easier and more comparable for investors and for companies. That's what I'm seeing from my end of the scope. So when I talk to companies about what kind of information they're asked to give investors through due diligence questionnaires, that sort of thing, when I talk to investors about what they're expected to give to, asset owners like pensions and the like, they are telling me about hundreds of due diligence questionnaires, all slightly different. So we talk about multiple jurisdictions and how confusing and awful that is to pull all that information together. But it's even worse when you're dealing with multiple stakeholders who are also asking for 100 different ways. So it's important to standardize so that you have efficiency around this, so that you have, ISSB, you have this type of disclosure. There's a digital taxonomy that ISSB has pulled out. You can put tags against these pieces of data, and then companies can easily gather it together, and you don't have this billions of spreadsheets through DDQs going to different parties. So the other thing is, of course, that this risk is not priced into the market. So it's a massive gap and blind spot that we all have, and we're not pricing it in, and it's kind of not priced in until it is. Like, I was around in finance during 2008, and I don't recommend it. 0 out of 10. So if we have something, that all of a sudden happens, we could have, an issue that happens overnight where all of a sudden this is really important. We can have, these sorts of regulations, the floor creep up on you, and these disclosures are required. It makes me think about some situations in the US where housing prices were what they were, and then all of a sudden a flood map is released, and then everything changes overnight because that invisible data, that risk that was there, that should have been priced in, wasn't priced in. So that financial market stability is a huge risk at the moment without having this data standardized, mandatory, verified, those types of things.
So I think internally, as I've already mentioned, like the performance management aspect, I think is going to be the biggest part of it. A step further than that, though, is the operationalization of that. And so I'll give you a good example. We've recently been working with companies on what we're calling facilities energy management. So picture you've got multiple building management systems that aren't talking to each other. They're gathering a ton of data, but you're not doing anything with the data. So we take that all, put it into sustainability data lake, and through AI, we have bidirectional communication with the properties. Through a variety of different parameters, we can actually save energy and therefore save costs. So example, it's a grocery store, okay? So you've got weather data coming in on what it's like outside. You've got the occupancy data of how many people are in the store, et cetera. You drop the set point of the HVAC system, therefore saving energy for that hour or two. Well, when you start to aggregate this up to a corporate level, you're talking like tens of millions of dollars in savings every single year. And oftentimes, what I mentioned at the very beginning today is that sustainability leaders have a hard time getting capital to fund things. All of a sudden, if you're saving the business a ton of money, and you're also saving the planet by lowering emissions, it's a much easier sell. So we really use data to bring sustainability to the broader business and really frame up those big problems. And that's where we've really seen sort of the biggest difference with some of our clients.
Yeah, and that's where you get the ROSI, right? The return on
Totally.
sustainable investment, right?
That's exactly it.
And Alka?
Say that with this data, one thing to keep in mind is it's not necessarily just a punishment that now we have to gather all this data and report all of it. It's giving you this greater transparency into what your operations are doing it, and it's giving greater transparency into what you can integrate into business strategy. Like, there are so many cost savings you could have by actually finding and working with these third-party suppliers. So now that you understand this data, you can make changes. A lot of companies are now saving money on their energy because they realized they could cut costs on a variety of different things. There's investments with renewable energy plants that are now, especially in Canada, becoming cheaper and cheaper as solar and wind energy becomes more prevalent. with data management, you really want to think about it's not just collecting the data, but it's what does the data say? What is this doing to our overall strategy? What can it support us in making a roadmap for the future? And when we're deciding which data to disclose, which data do we need to still collect more on, keeping it at the highest level of this is the data that's required for this regulation, this is the data that's required for this regulation, may not be as efficient as really understanding what are the topics that are being regulated in ESG data, and then having that data ready so that you can use it for the applicable jurisdiction and it's ready to go. And there's a process in place for when this legislation changes yet again.
And I think for everyone in the audience who's sitting there thinking, okay, well, the impact on me is maybe 3 or 5 years out. I saw on LinkedIn the other day a job posting for an internal audit climate risk, right? So if internal audit knows about it, then it's going to impact you pretty soon. Okay. So if we could open the floor, I guess, for questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Great panel. Thank you. And great topic. It looks like it's Europe who's leading the way on ESG and sustainability and environmental. Recently, there was an election in Europe, and the results of that election show that there's a decrease of the influence of the green parties. What does this mean for the rest of the world? And what does it mean for regulation coming up in terms of the impact on ESG?
That's a great question. Alka, you want to first take a stab, and maybe Lindsey might have something to say.
Absolutely. So with the European regulation, I think that they did know it was coming because in this legislative session alone, they passed over 25 parts of the Green Bill, including plastics regulation, water. So they made sure to embed it in the register already. And Europe doesn't have a huge history of overturning existing legislation that's already in place. Now, what will be added on in the future, that may be impacted. But one thing to note with the more conservative parties versus the green parties in Europe is their politics look very different from our Canadian politics or even US politics, that for us, a lot of the conservative parties may not be as interested in renewable energy or other green legislation. They just are less interested and want less detail, but they still will go with the existing regulation and still have an influence of, we still want to continue on the trend, but maybe pull back and not push so much. And I think with the global front, the rest of the world still has so much catching up to do with Europe that I still think even to get on that CSRD level, that's already the rules of the road for Europe, the US, Canada, UK even will continue to evolve to meet those standards and be prepared, especially as more of our North American companies fall under the European scope.
Lindsey?
Yeah, sure. That's very true. Very different politics. Most of my colleagues are in the UK. I think, I forget the stat, but I think it's over half of the world is going through elections this year, something crazy like that. So definitely a lot to pay attention to. But this issue is a speeding bus, and it's if you're not caught in the European rules yet, if you do business in California, you're caught in those rules, and all of these rules, like none of them are being pulled back. Really, they're being pushed forward. Even in the US, where we see a lot of anti-ESG rhetoric, some interesting judiciary hearings, we still see that companies maybe talking about it differently. They might say sustainability instead of ESG, change their terminology, get a little less loud about collaborative action so they don't get accused of collusion, those sorts of things. But they're still doing all the same work behind the scenes. So even in an environment like that, we're not actually seeing the practices change. We're just seeing the way they talk about it change a little bit in the terminology. But the actual work around using ESG data for investment decision-making, for proxy voting and stewardship initiatives, all of that is still happening at the same pace.
Okay, just one more question.
We have time for one more question. Anybody?
Anyway?
It's a question for Lindsey. You talked about like a different
reporting layers, and then everybody at that one layer is asking for the different type of data. Have you seen like somebody come in and say, well, I know what I need to provide you, right? And I'm going to standardize across all my requesters, if you will. And that's all you're going to get from me. Do you see this working model, or there's still everybody from the top saying, no, that's my requirement. You're going to go by what my requirement?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's different levels of leverage that folks to say that, but there's been some interesting things, like of course around regulation and ISSB, things are moving to a standardized-ish process where rather than having your own DDQ, you can look at the regulation disclosures. But we did see something interesting in private markets. So it's something called the ESG. Oh gosh, I'll remember the name in a second, but it's where the GPs were saying to the LPs, enough already with the DDQs that are all different. How about we all get together at data convergence project? How about we all get together and come up with a template that works for everyone? And so, the data convergence project is something that is used quite heavily in private equity investing. So we are seeing some examples of that, definitely.
Please, everybody, thank the panel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.